Early 1700s. The British Empire ruled the seas. Until one pirate made governors panic, shut down American ports, and turned the Atlantic into his stage. This isn't fiction. This isn't Hollywood. This is the true story of Blackbeard, the man who weaponized fear. In the early 18th century, when the American colonies were still fragile outposts clinging to the Atlantic coast, a single name could silence a harbor: Blackbeard. Born likely in Bristol, England, as Edward Teach, or Thatch, he emerged from the chaos left behind by the War of Spanish Succession, a global conflict that ended in 1713 and flooded the seas with unemployed privateers. These were hardened naval fighters once authorized to attack enemy ships in wartime. When peace came, their commissions vanished. Their skills did not. The Atlantic became crowded with men who knew only cannon smoke and salt air. Piracy was not born from madness. It was born from opportunity. The making of a maritime spectre. Teach likely served as a privateer before turning pirate. That experience shaped him. He understood naval tactics, the psychology of intimidation, and the fragile morale of merchant crews. Around 1716, he joined the pirate captain Benjamin Hornigold in the Caribbean, where he learned not just how to seize ships, but how to build a reputation. And reputation, he realized, was more powerful than gunpowder. When Teach captured a French slave vessel, La Concorde, he transformed it into something terrifying. He renamed it Queen Anne's Revenge, a name layered with political suggestion and defiance, and armed it with roughly 40 guns. In an age when most merchant ships carried fewer than 10, this was overwhelming force. But the cannons were not his greatest weapon. His beard was. Before battle, Blackbeard would weave slow-burning fuses into his thick black beard and light them. Smoke coiled around his face, framing wild eyes beneath a broad hat. Pistols hung across his chest. Cutlasses gleamed at his sides. He did not merely approach ships. He manifested. To frightened sailors squinting across the water, he looked less like a man and more like something infernal emerging from flame and sulfur. And ships surrendered, often without a fight. Contrary to later exaggerations, Blackbeard was not notorious for mass slaughter. Violence was inefficient. Dead sailors meant lost cargo, damaged ships, fewer ransoms. Fear achieved faster results. His legend did the work his blades did not need to. The sea as economic battlefield. In 1718, he performed one of the boldest acts of piracy in American colonial history, the blockade of Charleston, South Carolina. For nearly a week, he stopped ships entering or leaving the harbor. He captured passengers, including prominent citizens, and demanded a chest of medicine in exchange for their release. Not gold, not jewels, medicine. Disease had begun spreading among his crew, a reminder that pirates were as vulnerable to infection as any navy. The city complied. Blackbeard released the prisoners and vanished. It was humiliation on a grand scale. At the time, the colonies were economically dependent on maritime trade. Tobacco from Virginia, rice and indigo from the Carolinas, sugar and rum from the Caribbean. Enslaved Africans transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions. Every vanished vessel meant financial shockwaves. Blackbeard did not merely rob ships. He disrupted the bloodstream of empire. Insurance rates rose. Merchants panicked. Colonial governors faced pressure from London. Piracy had evolved from scattered crime into organized economic warfare. The paradox of pirate democracy. Here lies a twist history often overlooks. Pirate ships were, in some respects, more democratic than Royal Navy vessels. Pirate crews operated under written agreements, articles of agreement, that dictated rules of conduct, division of loot, and compensation for injuries. Captains were elected and could be removed. Plunder was shared by formula. On Royal Navy ships, by contrast, authority was absolute. Sailors endured low wages, disease, brutal discipline, and impressment, forced recruitment. Many were kidnapped from docks and compelled into service. To desperate sailors, piracy represented not chaos, but a rough form of equality. Blackbeard offered that equality inside a structure of terror. It created loyalty, and loyalty sustained his brief dominion. Pardon and deception. As pressure mounted, the British Crown shifted strategy. Instead of relying solely on force, it offered royal pardons to pirates willing to surrender. Divide and weaken. Blackbeard accepted a pardon in North Carolina in 1718. He married a local woman. For a moment, it appeared the legend might dissolve into domestic quiet. But piracy is not easily abandoned. Soon he was back at sea, smaller scale, perhaps more cautious, but still defiant. That defiance sealed his fate. The hunt and the fall. The governor of Virginia, frustrated by continued piracy and suspicious of North Carolina's leniency, secretly commissioned Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy to hunt Blackbeard down. On November 22, 1718, near Ocracoke Inlet, Maynard found him. Blackbeard's ship lay anchored in shallow waters. The pirate had been drinking heavily the night before, confident and perhaps careless. Maynard approached with smaller, lighter vessels. When Blackbeard fired his cannons, many of Maynard's men hid below deck to reduce visible casualties, making the ship appear crippled. Believing victory certain, Blackbeard boarded. It was a trap. Royal Navy sailors surged from below deck. Gunfire erupted at close range. Steel clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Blackbeard fought fiercely. Reports claim he sustained 5 gunshot wounds and over 20 cuts before finally collapsing. His sword reportedly snapped during the melee. When he fell, Maynard ordered his head severed and hung from the bowsprit of his ship. Proof. Warning. Theater. The Empire had to demonstrate control. Death of a man, birth of a myth. Stories quickly bloomed. Sailors whispered that Blackbeard's headless body swam around the ship 3 times before sinking. Children grew up fearing him. Writers romanticized him. Centuries later, film and fiction transformed him into archetype. But the legend rests on reality. Divers off the coast of North Carolina have recovered cannons, anchors, and medical instruments from the wreck believed to be Queen Anne's Revenge. Archaeology confirms what folklore amplified. He was real. More importantly, he was effective. He exposed weaknesses in colonial governance. He embarrassed British authority. He demonstrated how quickly maritime dominance could slip from imperial hands. Within a decade of his death, piracy declined sharply. The Royal Navy expanded patrols. Captured pirates were executed and displayed in iron cages along harbor entrances. The golden age of piracy, roughly 1650 to 1730, faded. But Blackbeard endured. The larger meaning. Blackbeard was not merely a criminal. He was a product of war, unemployment, imperial overreach, and economic inequality. He operated within, and exploited, the Atlantic system that included global trade and the horrors of the slave economy. His flagship itself had once transported enslaved Africans. He did not invent the system. He hijacked it. In doing so, he revealed how fragile it was. His rebellion was not ideological. He was not seeking liberty for mankind. Yet his defiance foreshadowed a theme that would echo decades later in the American Revolution. Authority can be challenged. Empires can be embarrassed. Control can fracture. For 2 brief years, he ruled not through conquest, but through perception. He understood branding centuries before the word existed. The smoking beard, the pistols, the silence before surrender. He crafted an image so powerful that it outlived his flesh. And that may be his most enduring lesson. Violence fades. Power shifts. Empires rise and stabilize. But image, when fused with fear, becomes myth. And myth is harder to kill than any pirate. Blackbeard ruled loudly, with smoke, with shadow, with spectacle, and though his body sank beneath the Atlantic in 1718, his legend never did. And yet, the story does not end with a body in the water. Because when a legend dies, something more complicated begins. The aftermath of a severed head. When Lieutenant Maynard returned to Virginia with Blackbeard's head hanging from his bowsprit, it was not simply proof of death. It was policy. It was propaganda. It was empire restoring order through spectacle. Public executions of pirates increased. Bodies were displayed in iron cages along major ports, left to rot as warnings to any sailor tempted by rebellion. London wanted stability, investors wanted security, colonial governors wanted control, and control required fear to change sides. For a brief moment, Blackbeard had weaponized fear against empire. Now empire reclaimed it. The Atlantic grew quieter, patrols intensified, royal pardons were used strategically to divide pirate crews. Captains were hunted methodically. By the 1730s, the golden age of piracy was effectively over. But something unexpected had happened. The pirates lost. The legend won. In the decades that followed, a strange transformation took place. The same men once labeled monsters became characters in stories. Ballads were sung, tales exaggerated, writers embellished. One of the most influential accounts, A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, often attributed to Captain Charles Johnson, helped shape how future generations would remember Blackbeard. The smoke became thicker, the beard darker, the battles more dramatic. History began blending with folklore. Blackbeard stopped being just Edward Teach. He became an archetype, the rebel, the outlaw king, the devil of the sea. And that transformation reveals something deeper about society. We often turn our villains into legends when enough time has passed that their danger no longer threatens us. Distance softens fear, and soft fear becomes fascination. Strip away the smoke and spectacle, and Blackbeard's rise makes brutal sense. The War of Spanish Succession ended. Privateers were dismissed. Thousands of trained naval fighters were unemployed in a maritime economy still dependent on armed ships. Trade networks were expanding rapidly between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Atlantic slave trade was accelerating. Sugar plantations demanded labor. Tobacco and rice exports grew. Ships moved constantly. Where there is movement, there is vulnerability. Blackbeard exploited supply chains before the term existed. He understood choke points, narrow shipping lanes, shallow inlets, harbor entrances. The Charleston blockade was not random aggression. It was strategic positioning at a vital artery of colonial commerce. He did not need to conquer territory. He needed only to interrupt flow. And interruption, in a trade empire, equals leverage. That concept feels modern because it is. Economic disruption remains one of the most powerful tools in global conflict today. Blackbeard simply applied it with cannons. Blackbeard's world was not simple. Pirate crews sometimes freed enslaved people from captured ships. Other times, they sold them. Sometimes formerly enslaved individuals joined pirate crews as equal members. Other times, they were forced. Piracy intersected directly with the transatlantic slave trade. Queen Anne's Revenge itself had once transported human cargo across the ocean under horrific conditions. Blackbeard operated within a violent economic system already in motion. He did not invent brutality. He navigated it. That does not absolve him, but it complicates him. History rarely offers pure villains or pure heroes. It offers participants in systems. And systems are messy. When Blackbeard blockaded Charleston in 1718, American colonists saw something shocking. British authority could be defied. A single rogue captain could paralyze a port. Imperial power was not invincible. Decades later, colonists would challenge Britain again, this time over taxes, trade laws, and representation. The American Revolution was not inspired by pirates, but the memory of fragile control lingered in colonial consciousness. Blackbeard was not a revolutionary, but he revealed cracks, and cracks change how people think about power. Centuries later, divers off the coast of North Carolina located a shipwreck believed to be Queen Anne's Revenge. Cannons lay buried in sand. Anchors rusted in silence. Medical instruments, syringes used to treat syphilis, were recovered, confirming accounts of disease among the crew. Gold dust traces were found. Fragments of a world once feared. Archaeology did what rumor could not. It grounded the myth in iron and wood. Blackbeard was not exaggerated fantasy. He was tangible. His ship existed. His war was real. There is one final irony. Reputation builds power, but it also builds expectation. When you become the most feared pirate in the Atlantic, you cannot fade quietly. You must escalate. You must perform. You must maintain dominance. Reputation demands spectacle, and spectacle draws attention. The Charleston blockade humiliated Britain publicly. That humiliation triggered a coordinated response. Without that bold display, perhaps Blackbeard might have survived longer as a quieter predator. But legends do not stay quiet, and empire does not forgive embarrassment. We remember Blackbeard because he embodies tension, order versus chaos, empire versus outlaw, control versus freedom, security versus risk. There is something deeply human about fascination with those who live outside rules. Even when those rules are necessary. Even when the outlaw is dangerous. Blackbeard's life was short, likely under 40 years. His reign lasted barely 2. But impact is not measured in time. It is measured in disruption. He disrupted trade. He disrupted governance. He disrupted confidence. And disruption leaves marks. After his death, the Atlantic did not immediately calm. Other pirates continued briefly, but without towering figures like Blackbeard, piracy fragmented. The British Navy expanded. Colonial defenses strengthened. Trade stabilized. The sea became an imperial highway once more. But the ocean remembers. It remembers storms, shipwrecks, cannons sinking into sand, and men who believed they could rule it. Blackbeard did not rule forever. He ruled loudly, and sometimes, loudness echoes longer than longevity. Long after the smoke faded over Ocracoke, after the severed head rotted away, after empires stabilized and revolutions came and went, the image remained, a dark ship on the horizon, black sails against the sun, smoke curling around a face half hidden in flame, a reminder that power is never permanent, and that sometimes, the most dangerous weapon in history is not steel, not gunpowder, not fleets, but fear, carefully crafted, and deliberately unleashed. And still, there is one more layer beneath the legend. Because history does not only remember what happened, it remembers what a culture chooses to keep alive. In the 1700s, mothers used his name to frighten children into obedience. By the 1800s, writers used his name to sell books. By the 1900s, filmmakers used his name to sell adventure. Somewhere along the way, Blackbeard stopped being a threat and became entertainment. The smoke became theatrical. The violence became stylized. The pirate became charming. That transformation says more about us than it does about him. When a society feels stable, it romanticizes its former dangers. Once piracy no longer threatened shipping lanes, it became safe to admire the defiance. The same colonies once terrified by his blockade would later build a nation that celebrated rebellion. Time reframes criminals as characters. Distance turns blood into story. The machinery of empire. Blackbeard's death marked more than the fall of a pirate. It marked a shift in imperial strategy. Britain realized something critical. Sea power required constant enforcement. Trade routes were arteries of wealth. If pirates could interrupt them, then naval dominance had to be permanent, not occasional. The Royal Navy expanded. Ports fortified. Maritime law strengthened. Insurance systems became more sophisticated. Blackbeard exposed the vulnerability of empire, and empire adapted. In that sense, he shaped policy without holding office, commanded reform without writing law. He forced evolution, and that is a rare form of influence. The short life of freedom. Piracy offered freedom, but it was a brutal freedom. Life aboard pirate ships was harsh. Food spoiled, water stagnated, injuries festered, storms destroyed masts and snapped hulls. Death came quickly. Few pirates grew old. Blackbeard himself likely died before reaching 40. The freedom he offered was immediate and intense, but rarely long. It was rebellion without sustainability. Exciting, profitable for a moment, fatal in the long run. That is often the cost of living outside powerful systems. The reality behind the smoke. Strip away the myth entirely, and Edward Teach becomes clearer. He was intelligent, patient, observant, strategic. He chose intimidation over massacre. He preferred surrender to slaughter. He knew that fear preserved cargo. He maintained discipline among his crew. He navigated political relationships with colonial governors when useful. He accepted a pardon when pressure mounted. He resumed piracy when opportunity returned. He adapted constantly. That is not madness. That is calculation. And calculation is far more dangerous than chaos. The final image. Imagine the Atlantic in 1718. No satellites, no telegraphs, no centralized coast guard. Just wind, wood, canvas, gunpowder, and rumor. In that world, reputation moved faster than ships. If sailors in the Caribbean whispered about a demon captain with a burning beard, crews in Virginia heard about it weeks later, and believed it. Information was slow, but fear was fast, and Blackbeard understood how to ride that current. He turned himself into a story while still alive. Most legends are written after death. He authored his in real time. The symbol that remains. Today, when people think of pirates, they picture elements he helped define. The dark beard, the pistols across the chest, the theatrical menace, the defiant laugh against authority. He did not invent piracy, but he defined its aesthetic. He became the template. That is why he remains the most remembered pirate in American history. Not because he looted the most ships, but because he controlled imagination. And imagination outlives statistics. The ocean keeps its secrets. Off the coast of North Carolina, waves still roll over the wreck believed to be Queen Anne's Revenge. Iron cannons sit beneath shifting sand. Artifacts surface slowly through archaeological work. The ocean does not rush to reveal its past. It preserves it, quietly, patiently, just as it preserved his story. Because in the end, Blackbeard was not just a pirate. He was a moment when power slipped. When empire blinked. When the sea answered to someone else. Briefly, violently, memorably. And that may be the truest measure of his legacy. Not the gold he stole. Not the ships he captured. Not even the men he frightened. But the fact that 3 centuries later, we are still telling his story. The cannons are silent. The beard has long since turned to dust. The empire he defied has transformed. But the image remains. A black flag on the horizon. Smoke rising in the sun. And a reminder that sometimes, for a short, dangerous moment, one man can make the world tremble. And even now, there is something unfinished about him. Because Blackbeard's story is not just about the past. It is about the pattern. The pattern of power and collapse. History moves in cycles. War creates soldiers. Peace abandons them. Displacement breeds unrest. Unrest finds opportunity. Blackbeard was born in that space between war and stability. The gap where governments are slow to adjust and men trained for violence search for purpose. When the War of Spanish Succession ended, the British Empire celebrated victory. But victory came with a side effect. Thousands of hardened privateers suddenly had no legal enemy. They had ships, cannons, crews, skills sharpened by conflict, and very few options on land. Some reintegrated, many did not. Blackbeard did not. He represents what happens when a system discards those it once empowered. That pattern has repeated across centuries. And every time it does, instability follows. The Atlantic as a testing ground. In the early 1700s, the Atlantic Ocean was the center of global wealth. Not Europe, not America, the water itself. Ships carried sugar that sweetened Europe, tobacco that fed addiction, gold and silver extracted from colonies, and human beings chained in darkness. The ocean was not just blue water. It was a highway of exploitation and profit. Blackbeard inserted himself into that highway like a toll collector with cannons. He did not seek to dismantle empire. He skimmed from it, and that may be why he was so effective. He did not challenge the system's structure. He exploited its speed, reputation as currency. There is a reason his legend endured more strongly than many pirates who captured more ships or amassed greater wealth. Blackbeard understood branding centuries before modern corporations. He crafted an identity so dramatic that it traveled independently of him. A ship in the Bahamas might surrender simply because they thought Blackbeard might be nearby. He became a rumor with teeth. And rumor is scalable. It spreads without payroll. It multiplies without fleets. He understood that power does not always require expansion. Sometimes it requires amplification, the moment before the fall. By late 1718, something had shifted. His blockade of Charleston was bold, but boldness attracts scrutiny. He had grown too visible, too symbolic. When North Carolina's governor offered him a pardon, it was political convenience. Pirates could be useful allies in murky colonial politics. Trade, bribery, and unofficial agreements blurred the lines between outlaw and official. But the governor of Virginia saw a threat to his own stability. And empires do not tolerate competing centers of influence. Maynard's mission was not random enforcement. It was targeted removal. The Atlantic could tolerate scattered piracy. It could not tolerate a pirate king. The human moment. Imagine that final morning near Ocracoke. The mist low on the water. The air heavy with salt. Blackbeard likely believed he could win. He had survived storms, ambushes, naval encounters. He had built a reputation that bent weaker captains. Confidence becomes habit. Habit becomes vulnerability. When Maynard's hidden sailors surged onto the deck, it was the first time Blackbeard's theatrical dominance failed him. No surrender, no fear, just steel and gunfire. And in that close, brutal fight, reputation meant nothing. Only flesh, only breath, only endurance. It took multiple bullets, multiple cuts, and still he fought. That detail alone ensured immortality. Because humans revere resistance, even in enemies. The shift in memory. After his death, piracy declined, but rebellion did not. Within 60 years, the American colonies would revolt against Britain. Different motivations, different leaders, different outcomes, but a similar tension. Authority challenged, control resisted. It is not that Blackbeard inspired revolution. It is that he existed in a culture already testing the limits of imperial power. He was a symptom before he became a symbol. Why he still fascinates. We live in structured societies. Laws, borders, institutions. There is safety in that. But there is also constraint. Blackbeard represents the fantasy of absolute autonomy. No taxes, no commands from distant monarchs, no imposed hierarchy beyond the ship. But fantasy ignores cost, disease, short lives, violence, constant pursuit, freedom at the edge of a blade. Still, the image of radical independence appeals across centuries. That is why pirates endure in popular imagination. They stand at the boundary between chaos and control, and Blackbeard stood at the center of that boundary. The quiet truth. When all mythology is stripped away, what remains? A man shaped by war. A sailor skilled in combat. A strategist who preferred intimidation over bloodshed. A leader who balanced fear and fairness aboard his ship. A disruptor who exposed the fragility of empire. A life that burned intensely for 2 years, and then ended abruptly in shallow water. That is the truth beneath the smoke. The final reflection. Empires last centuries. Pirates last seasons. But sometimes a single season leaves deeper scars than a century of stability. Blackbeard's reign was short, yet his name eclipsed governors, admirals, and merchant princes. Because fear leaves sharper memory than bureaucracy. Because spectacle outlives paperwork. Because rebellion fascinates even those who condemn it. The Atlantic has swallowed countless ships. Thousands of unnamed sailors. Storms without witnesses. Battles without records. But it did not swallow him. His story surfaced, and stayed. A black sail against bright sun. Smoke in a beard. Cannons ready. A reminder that power is never absolute. And that for a brief, dangerous window in history, the sea belonged to a man who understood that perception can conquer faster than force. And that is why, centuries later, Blackbeard still sails through memory, long after the tide carried him under. And if we follow the story to its furthest edge, we arrive not at the sea, but at ourselves. The invention of the pirate myth. Centuries after his death, Blackbeard no longer belonged to the Atlantic. He belonged to imagination. Writers reshaped him. Playwrights exaggerated him. Illustrators darkened his silhouette and thickened the smoke. By the time adventure novels flourished in the 1800s, piracy had become safely distant. No longer a real threat to shipping lanes. That distance allowed transformation. Fear became fantasy. Danger became drama. Blackbeard became shorthand for the ultimate sea villain. Yet notice something important. Very few people can name the colonial governors he embarrassed. Fewer still can name the admirals who expanded the Royal Navy afterward. But almost everyone recognizes the image of the smoking bearded pirate. History forgets administrators. It remembers archetypes. The archetype of the rebel. Blackbeard's endurance rests in the archetype he represents. He stands for the individual who steps outside structure. The man who answers to no crown. The captain who elects his own authority. The outlaw who writes his own code. That archetype appears again and again in culture. The gunslinger of the American West. The revolutionary leader. The rogue entrepreneur. The anti-hero who bends rules to survive. Blackbeard became one of the earliest American embodiments of that figure, decades before the Revolution formalized rebellion into national identity. He lived outside the law, but inside the imagination, a mirror of the Atlantic world. To understand his full meaning, you must widen the lens. The early 1700s Atlantic was not romantic. It was brutal. The slave trade was expanding. Plantation wealth was rising. European empires competed fiercely. Disease ravaged ships. Storms erased crews overnight. Piracy existed inside that violent ecosystem. Blackbeard did not disrupt a peaceful world. He operated within a ruthless one. Merchant vessels transported enslaved Africans in horrific conditions. Privateers plundered under legal sanction. Empires seized land and extracted labor. Piracy was not an anomaly. It was a mutation, and mutations reveal the structure of the organism they inhabit. The fragility of control. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Blackbeard's story is how thin control truly is. In 1718, a single ship blockaded Charleston. One vessel halted trade in a major colonial port. That fact should linger. Empires project strength, but strength depends on coordination, on response time, on communication, on enforcement. When those falter, even briefly, disruption flourishes. Blackbeard found that gap, and stepped into it. The personal cost of legend. There is also tragedy beneath the legend. Edward Teach likely did not set out to become immortal. He sought profit, opportunity, survival. His myth grew larger than his intention. And myths demand escalation. Once he became Blackbeard, retreat became impossible. A legend cannot quietly fade into obscurity. It must either dominate, or fall dramatically. He fell dramatically, and that ensured permanence. The ocean as witness. Stand today on the coast of North Carolina. Watch the waves roll in. They look unchanged, but beneath them lie cannons and ballast stones from ships that once carried terror and trade alike. The ocean keeps artifacts without judgment. It does not care for empire or rebellion. It swallows both. Blackbeard's ship rotted beneath salt water for centuries before discovery. Iron corroded, wood softened, but fragments survived. Enough to confirm that legend had weight. Enough to prove that smoke once curled from a real man's beard. The fragility of control. Perhaps the most enduring lesson of Blackbeard's story is how thin control truly is. In 1718, a single ship blockaded Charleston. One vessel halted trade in a major colonial port. That fact should linger. Empires project strength, but strength depends on coordination, on response time, on communication, on enforcement. When those falter, even briefly, disruption flourishes. Blackbeard found that gap, and stepped into it. The personal cost of legend. There is also tragedy beneath the legend. Edward Teach likely did not set out to become immortal. He sought profit, opportunity, survival. His myth grew larger than his intention. And myths demand escalation. Once he became Blackbeard, retreat became impossible. A legend cannot quietly fade into obscurity. It must either dominate, or fall dramatically. He fell dramatically, and that ensured permanence. The ocean as witness. Stand today on the coast of North Carolina. Watch the waves roll in. They look unchanged, but beneath them lie cannons and ballast stones from ships that once carried terror and trade alike. The ocean keeps artifacts without judgment. It does not care for empire or rebellion. It swallows both. Blackbeard's ship rotted beneath salt water for centuries before discovery. Iron corroded, wood softened, but fragments survived, enough to confirm that legend had weight, enough to prove that smoke once curled from a real man's beard. The end that was not an end. After his death, piracy diminished, but the spirit of defiance did not vanish from American shores. Within 2 generations, colonists would resist British taxation. Within 3, they would declare independence. Blackbeard was not a revolutionary thinker, but he existed in a region already learning that imperial authority could be tested. He was one note in a much larger symphony of tension, and sometimes a single note changes how the entire piece feels. Why we still tell it? We tell Blackbeard's story because it satisfies something primal. It contains power seized, authority challenged, a rise, a spectacle, a violent fall. It is mythic in structure, but historical in substance. That combination is rare and powerful. The last image. Imagine again the horizon in 1718. No engines, no radar, just wind and wood. A black silhouette emerging slowly against sunlight. Sails dark, cannons ready, smoke beginning to curl. For the sailors who saw him then, the story was not romantic. It was immediate, terrifying, real. For us, it is distant, layered with interpretation, but still magnetic, because deep down, we recognize the tension he embodied. Freedom versus order, fear versus control, individual versus empire. That tension has never disappeared. It simply changes form. Blackbeard ruled for barely 2 years. Empires have lasted centuries, but centuries later, when we picture the golden age of piracy, we do not see bureaucrats. We do not see trade agreements. We see him, the beard, the smoke, the dark flag cutting across bright sky. A reminder that sometimes history is not shaped by those who govern longest, but by those who burn brightest. And in the early 1700s, on the restless edge of a young America, one man burned so fiercely that even death could not extinguish his name. And if we let the smoke clear one final time, what remains is not just the legend, but the lesson beneath the legend. Blackbeard's life forces a difficult realization. Power is rarely absolute. It is negotiated, tested, exposed. In 1718, the British Empire was one of the most formidable forces on Earth. Its navy was expanding. Its trade network spanned continents. Its colonies generated immense wealth. And yet, a single pirate captain disrupted it. Not permanently, not fatally, but visibly. That visibility mattered, because power depends as much on perception as on strength. Blackbeard attacked perception, and perception bled. The thin line between outlaw and officer. There is another truth hidden in his story. Before he was a pirate, Edward Teach was likely a privateer, essentially a legalized pirate authorized by the crown during wartime. The difference between hero and criminal was paperwork. A commission, a signature. When war ended, so did his legal protection. But his skills remained identical. The cannons were the same. The tactics unchanged. Only the label shifted. This reveals something uncomfortable about history. Sometimes outlaw and officer are separated by politics, not morality. That blurred boundary helped fuel piracy's rise. Men who once fought for empire simply continued fighting, only now for themselves. Blackbeard was not an outsider to the system. He was once part of it, and systems often struggle most with those they trained. The speed of collapse. Blackbeard's career was meteoric. He rose quickly, dominated briefly, fell violently. 2 years. That is all. Yet within those 2 years, he blockaded a port, commanded multiple ships, negotiated with governors, accepted a royal pardon, and forced the British Navy into direct action. That concentration of impact is astonishing. It reminds us that influence does not require longevity. Sometimes it requires timing. He appeared at a moment when empire was distracted, stretched thin, and adjusting to peace. Had he emerged a decade later, he might have been crushed immediately. A decade earlier, he might have remained one pirate among many. But in 1716 to 1718, the timing was perfect. History often turns on timing more than ambition. The quiet aftermath. After his death, The Atlantic did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it tightened. The Royal Navy strengthened its patrols. Colonial governors coordinated more carefully. Public executions became warnings. Pirate crews fractured. The Golden Age waned. Order reasserted itself. That, too, is part of the pattern. Rebellion peaks. Authority responds. Balance shifts. Blackbeard's existence accelerated that response. In a strange way, he helped solidify the very system he defied. The human element. It is easy to speak of him in mythic tones. But at the center was a human being. He laughed, drank, negotiated, planned, feared disease, managed morale, trusted some men, doubted others. He likely knew his life expectancy was short. Pirates rarely died peacefully. Did he believe he would escape? Did he assume legend would shield him? Or did he simply accept risk as the cost of his chosen path? We cannot know, but on that final morning at Ocracoke, beneath the smoke and gunfire, he was no longer a symbol. He was a man fighting to survive. And survival is the most human instinct of all. The enduring shadow. 3 centuries later, the word pirate still conjures his image. Not the dozens of lesser captains. Not the bureaucrats who signed execution orders. Him. Why? Because he understood something fundamental. If you control how you are seen, you control how you are remembered. He engineered fear so effectively that it outlived him. He performed menace so convincingly that it became history. He built a persona strong enough to eclipse the details of his actual crimes. That is rare and powerful. The ocean moves on. The Atlantic today is crossed by container ships guided by satellites. Naval fleets operate with advanced technology. Global trade moves at a scale unimaginable in 1718. Yet the core vulnerability remains. Ships still carry wealth. Routes still matter. Choke points still exist. And wherever wealth travels through narrow passages, there is opportunity for disruption. Blackbeard exploited wind and wood. Modern disruptors use different tools. But the principle is unchanged. The final horizon. Picture it once more. A young American coastline. Wooden docks. Merchants scanning the horizon. And then, a dark shape where none should be. Sails black against bright Carolina sun. Cannons hidden behind ports. Smoke curling upward. In that moment, before the first shot, everything depended on belief. If they believed they could win, they fought. If they believed they faced the devil, they surrendered. Blackbeard lived in that moment of belief. And that is where he remains. Not just in textbooks, not just in museums, but in the timeless space between order and rebellion, where fear meets opportunity, and one determined figure steps forward to test the strength of the world. He ruled briefly, fell violently, and became eternal, because sometimes history does not remember who governed. It remembers who dared. And on the restless edge of the Atlantic, in the fragile youth of America, Edward Teach dared, and daring is rarely quiet. The sound of his name. In the years immediately after his death, sailors still spoke his name carefully. Not out of superstition, but habit. For 2 years, Blackbeard had meant sudden violence, unpredictable blockade, the loss of cargo, ransom demands, smoke on the wind. When a name becomes shorthand for danger, it lingers in language long after the threat fades. Even as piracy declined, his name survived in tavern stories and dockside warnings. It traveled port to port, not carried by cannons, but by conversation. And conversation is one of the oldest vessels in history. From flesh to folklore, the transformation from man to myth follows a predictable arc. First comes fear, then exaggeration, then symbolism, finally, simplification. Blackbeard the strategist became Blackbeard the monster. Blackbeard the negotiator became Blackbeard the demon. Blackbeard the opportunist became Blackbeard the embodiment of piracy itself. Complexity faded. Image remained. This is how memory works. We compress the complicated into something easier to hold. A beard, a flame, a black sail, the irony of immortality. Here is the ultimate irony. If he had lived longer, he might have been forgotten. A gradual decline into obscurity. A quiet retirement under a pardon. A minor footnote in maritime archives. But death in battle, violent, dramatic, excessive, sealed his place. 5 gunshot wounds, over 20 sword cuts, a severed head displayed as warning. Such an ending refuses anonymity. It demands narrative, and narrative creates permanence. The edge of control. Blackbeard's story continues to resonate because it exists at the edge of structure. He did not seek to overthrow Britain. He did not draft manifestos. He did not build a new nation. He simply tested the limits of enforcement. And in doing so, he revealed something universal. Every system has edges, and edges can be exploited. He thrived where communication was slow, where authority was distant, where coordination faltered. That space, between intention and enforcement, is where disruption lives. The afterlife of a symbol. Long after the Atlantic quieted, Blackbeard found new oceans to sail. He entered novels. He entered theater. He entered paintings, then cinema, then television. Each era reshaped him according to its own anxieties. In times of strict order, he became thrilling rebellion. In times of instability, he became comic exaggeration. In children's tales, he softened into caricature. In darker retellings, he returned to shadow and flame. But no matter the version, the core image persisted. The beard, the smoke, the defiance. He stopped being Edward Teach entirely. He became a mask worn by storytelling itself. The psychology of the pirate. There is something deeply psychological about why he endures. Pirates operate outside hierarchy. They reject imposed structure. They claim autonomy in environments where autonomy is rare. For sailors pressed into service by the Royal Navy, piracy looked like agency. For colonists bound by imperial trade laws, piracy looked like resistance. For modern audiences constrained by bureaucracy and routine, piracy looks like freedom. Blackbeard represents the fantasy of self-determination without permission. That fantasy is timeless. It survives centuries because it addresses a human impulse that never disappears. The cost of the fantasy. But freedom without structure has gravity. Pirate crews faced constant danger. Storms destroyed ships without warning. Injuries meant infection. Infection meant death. Trust could fracture under greed. Mutiny was always possible. The same democracy that elected captains could remove them. Authority was fragile aboard pirate vessels too. Blackbeard balanced that fragility with intimidation and reputation. But even he could not outrun consequence forever. The fantasy is powerful. The reality was brutal. That tension between allure and cost keeps the story alive. The empire he tested. The British Empire did not collapse because of Blackbeard. But it learned. It strengthened naval patrols. It coordinated colonial governance more carefully. It refined maritime law. It professionalized enforcement. Piracy forced adaptation. And adaptation preserved dominance. In that sense, Blackbeard became a catalyst. A small shock that triggered structural reinforcement. History is filled with such figures. Disruptors whose defeat strengthens the systems they challenge. The silence after the gunfire. Imagine the moment after the battle at Ocracoke ended. Smoke thinning. Bodies still. The creak of wood settling. The ocean resuming its indifferent rhythm. Maynard standing over the fallen pirate. Victory achieved. Order restored. Yet even in that silence, something irreversible had happened. The story had begun. Because stories are born in moments of extremity. And extremity was written into that deck in blood. The shape of memory. Over time, facts blur. Details conflict. Numbers vary. But the outline remains sharp. He blockaded Charleston. He commanded Queen Anne's revenge. He lit fuses in his beard. He died fighting. That outline is enough. Memory does not require precision. It requires impact. Blackbeard left an impact deep enough that centuries could not smooth it away. The endless horizon. The horizon is a powerful metaphor because it is always ahead. Always unreachable. Blackbeard lived on that line. Between order and chaos. Between employment and outlawry. Between service to empire and defiance of it. Between man and myth. He never fully belonged to one side. And that in-between space is where legends thrive. Why we continue? We continue telling his story because it reflects enduring truths. Systems are vulnerable. Reputation can be weaponized. Authority depends on perception. Freedom is costly. Myth is stronger than mortality. Blackbeard did not live long, but he lived symbolically, and symbolic lives echo. The final image, once more. Not for drama, not for exaggeration, but because it is accurate to how memory works. A ship appears on the horizon, dark against bright sky. No one yet knows if it carries trade or terror. That uncertainty is the essence of his legacy. He turned open water into doubt. He turned rumor into surrender. He turned himself into an emblem. And once someone becomes an emblem, they stop belonging to their own lifetime. They belong to history. And history, like the ocean, does not forget what once disturbed its surface. Edward Teach disturbed it. Briefly, violently, unforgettably. And so long as humans look toward uncertain horizons, Blackbeard will continue sailing there. Smoke curling upward. A reminder that even the mightiest systems can be shaken by one figure, bold enough to try. And if we keep following that dark sail, we begin to see something even larger than the man. The nature of disruption. Blackbeard did not build an empire. He interrupted one. That distinction is important. Builders create structures meant to last. Disruptors reveal weaknesses in structures that already exist. Blackbeard revealed that the Atlantic, despite Britain's naval strength, was not fully controlled. He revealed that communication delays could be exploited. He revealed that colonial coordination was imperfect. He revealed that fear could move faster than ships. He did not need permanence. He needed pressure, and pressure changes systems. The currency of fear. Fear is one of the oldest currencies in human history. It requires no mint, no treasury, no infrastructure, only belief. Blackbeard invested in fear early. The burning fuses, the layered pistols, the slow, deliberate approach. He amplified rumor. He allowed exaggeration to grow. He rarely corrected it, because the more terrifying the story, the easier the surrender. In modern terms, he scaled influence without scaling violence. He increased effect without increasing cost. That is strategic brilliance, even if applied to crime. The edge between order and chaos. Societies need order to function. Trade requires predictability. Law requires enforcement. Security requires stability. But order, when rigid, creates pressure at its edges. And those edges attract challenges. Blackbeard stood precisely there, not in the center of empire, not entirely outside it, but at the margins, where enforcement thinned and opportunity widened. The margins are always volatile, and volatility produces legends. Mortality versus memory. Blackbeard's physical life ended in 1718. His symbolic life began that same day. That is the paradox of dramatic death. The body stops. The story accelerates. Maynard intended to end a threat. Instead, he preserved an icon. The severed head displayed on the bowsprit was meant as warning. It became advertisement. Proof that someone had once been powerful enough to require such spectacle. Even suppression can magnify myth. The pattern repeats. Across history, similar figures emerge. Individuals who seize unstable moments, who harness perception, who operate faster than bureaucracy can respond, who become symbols larger than their actions. Some are revolutionaries, some are criminals, some are entrepreneurs. The category matters less than the pattern. Blackbeard fits that pattern perfectly. He saw instability, he stepped into it, he amplified it, and for a brief moment, he dominated it. The ocean as metaphor. The sea itself is symbolic. It represents uncertainty, movement, risk, opportunity. Blackbeard's power depended on that fluid environment. There were no fixed borders, no walls, only roots and currents. He mastered a landscape that refused permanence. That fluidity mirrors his legacy. He cannot be confined neatly into hero or villain. He shifts with interpretation, like the tide. The last quiet thought. Perhaps the most powerful element of his story is its brevity. 2 years. That is all. 2 years of dominance. 2 years of fear. 2 years that echoed for 3 centuries. It suggests something profound. Impact is not measured by duration. It is measured by intensity. Blackbeard's flame burned hot enough that its light still flickers in memory. The final horizon. And so, we end where we began. With a horizon. In 1718, it was a line of danger. Today, it is a line of reflection. Back then, sailors squinted toward it in fear. Now, we look toward it in curiosity. But the image remains the same. A dark sail against sunlight. Smoke rising slowly. A figure who understood that perception can bend reality. Edward Teach lived. Blackbeard performed. The man died. The performance survived. And somewhere in the vast, restless idea of the Atlantic, between history and myth, he is still sailing, not because he conquered the sea, but because he conquered imagination. And imagination, unlike empires, has no end. And when imagination takes hold, it does something history alone cannot. It turns events into mirrors. A mirror across centuries. Blackbeard's story endures not just because it is dramatic, but because each generation sees something different in him. To 18th century merchants, he was chaos. To naval officers, he was a problem to be solved. To struggling sailors, he was possibility. To later Americans, he became rebellion before revolution. To modern audiences, he is freedom wrapped in danger. The facts remain the same. The meaning shifts. And that shifting meaning keeps him alive. The space between lore and legend. There is a thin space between legality and legitimacy. Blackbeard crossed it. Privateer 1 year, pirate the next. Sanctioned violence becomes unsanctioned violence with a change in politics. That fragile boundary exposes something uncomfortable. Authority decides what is lawful, but perception decides what is remembered. The Crown called him criminal. History calls him legendary. Those are not the same thing. The cost of becoming a symbol. When a person becomes a symbol, individuality fades. Edward Teach likely had ordinary habits. Private doubts. Moments of boredom. Moments of fear. Those details vanished beneath smoke and myth. Symbols simplify. Humans complicate. The simplification is what survives. And so the real man dissolves, leaving only the silhouette, the echo of Ocracoke. Picture Ocracoke one final time. Shallow water, early light, 2 ships closing distance, gunpowder thick in the air, the clash of steel, then silence. That silence did not erase him. It amplified him, because extreme endings imprint memory. And memory travels farther than ships ever could. The unfinished current. There is a reason piracy still fascinates modern culture. It lives at the intersection of danger and autonomy, of risk and reward, of law and defiance. Blackbeard stands at the center of that intersection. He did not invent piracy. He distilled it. He gave it a face powerful enough to endure. And that endurance is his final victory. What remains? No gold hoard survived with his name attached. No pirate kingdom rose from his banner. No ideology carried his words. What remains is simpler. An image, a feeling, a tension, a reminder that systems can be shaken. That fear can be engineered. That reputation can travel faster than fleets. And that sometimes, very briefly, one determined individual can bend the rhythm of an entire region. The last reflection. History often celebrates those who build, but it also remembers those who test. Blackbeard tested the Atlantic world, tested British authority, tested colonial security, tested the limits of fear as strategy. He did not last, but he mattered, and sometimes that is enough. So if you stand at the edge of the Carolina coast, watching the horizon blur into sky, know this: 3 centuries ago, that same line carried uncertainty, and from that uncertainty emerged a figure who understood something timeless. Control the image, control the fear, control the moment. The moment passes, the image remains, and in that enduring image, smoke curling in sunlight, Blackbeard still sails, not through water, but through memory, and memory, like the ocean, has no shore, and perhaps that is where his story truly settles. Not in the clash of steel, not in the thunder of cannon, but in the quiet understanding that history is shaped as much by disruption as by design. The moment that defines a legend. Every legend has a defining image. For kings, it is a crown. For generals, a battlefield victory. For revolutionaries, a declaration. For Blackbeard, it was spectacle. The slow approach, the deliberate silence, the smoke weaving through his beard like something supernatural. He did not simply attack ships. He staged encounters. He transformed maritime conflict into theater. And theater imprints memory deeper than routine. The fragility of stability. When we look back at early colonial America, it can seem inevitable that Britain would dominate the seas. But in 1718, nothing felt inevitable. Trade was vulnerable. Communication was slow. Authority depended on distance and trust. Blackbeard exposed how fragile that stability truly was. Not by conquering territory, but by interrupting expectation. And interruption is powerful, because it forces adaptation. The difference between fear and respect. There is another subtle truth in his story. Blackbeard commanded fear, but within his crew, he also commanded respect. Pirate captains could be voted out. Crews operated under agreed rules. Shares of loot were distributed by code. In a harsh, uncertain world, predictability within the crew mattered. He balanced terror outward with structure inward. That duality sustained him. Without discipline, piracy dissolves into chaos. Without fear, piracy loses leverage. He maintained both, until the balance tipped. The end of an era. After his death, piracy did not vanish immediately, but it lost its towering figure. The golden age of piracy faded into smaller, less dramatic episodes. Without a central icon, the movement fragmented, and that fragmentation made suppression easier. Blackbeard's fall symbolized the closing of a brief, volatile window in Atlantic history. The sea did not become safer overnight, but it became more controlled, and control reasserted itself steadily. The human fascination with edges. Why do we remain captivated? Because humans are drawn to edges. The edge of maps, the edge of law, the edge of possibility. Blackbeard lived on the edge of empire. Not entirely outside civilization, but not fully inside it either. That liminal space is where stories thrive. It is unpredictable, dangerous, alive, and he mastered it. The legacy beyond fact. The details of his life can be debated. The number of ships he captured. The exact nature of his personality. The motivations behind his choices. But none of that changes the central truth. He altered perception, and perception outlives data. We may refine the record, but the image remains intact. A horizon that never closes. The Atlantic horizon today looks calm, but calm is always conditional. Trade routes still matter. Authority still relies on coordination. Reputation still shapes response. Blackbeard's methods belong to another century, but the principles endure. Disruption, timing, image, fear. These forces are not relics. They are constants. The final thought. In the end, Edward Teach was mortal. His wounds were real. His blood was real. His death was final. But Blackbeard, the constructed figure of smoke and shadow, was never entirely flesh to begin with. He was part strategy, part performance, part opportunity, and part myth from the moment he lit the first fuse in his beard. That combination ensured survival beyond death. So the story continues not because he ruled long, but because he ruled memorably. Not because he built a nation, but because he shook one. Not because he changed the world permanently, but because he proved it could be unsettled. And that idea, that even vast systems can tremble, is powerful enough to endure centuries. On the horizon of history, some figures fade into the mist. Others cut across it like dark sails against sunlight. Blackbeard cut across it, briefly, brilliantly, and left a wake that time has never fully smoothed away. And so, the smoke cleared. The cannons fell silent. The Atlantic kept moving. Edward Teach lay dead in the water. The British Crown declared order restored. Merchants breathed again. Governors felt secure. But something had changed. Because for 2 brief years, one man had exposed how fragile power truly was. He had shown that empires can be embarrassed, that trade can be interrupted, that authority can hesitate. He did not conquer nations. He did not build kingdoms. He did something more unsettling. He made the mighty nervous. And that is why he endured. Not because he stole the most gold. Not because he killed the most men. But because he mastered perception, he understood that fear travels faster than ships. That reputation can win battles before cannons fire. That image can outlive flesh. His body sank. His head was displayed. His crew scattered. His era ended. But the silhouette remained. A black sail on the horizon. Smoke rising in the sun. A reminder that power is never permanent. That control is never absolute. And that sometimes, history is shaped not by those who rule the longest, but by those who dare the loudest. Blackbeard ruled for barely 2 years. Yet centuries later, we still speak his name. Because legends are not measured in time. They are measured in impact. And in the early 1700s, on the fragile edge of a young America, one pirate made the Atlantic tremble. The man is gone. The empire changed. But the image endures. And somewhere in the space between history and myth, that dark sail still rises. Silent, defiant, unforgotten.